Welcome back to the Wednesday night Bible study. We're looking at the story of Daniel in the book of Daniel. We're going to cover Daniel chapter 2. It's a lot of verses we're going to try to get through this time. This is our third installment, and this is called, I'm calling it the Deadly Decree. So last week, if you recall, we were introduced to Daniel and his three friends. These were a group of teenagers picked out of the captives who were sent to Babylon, including Daniel. They were young, good-looking, royalty. They were to go to school for 3 years, learning a lot of things, and it would be a life of luxury. They were even to be given a portion of the food and wine from the king's table, and that was a significant part of the story last time. The 4 young boys were given new names by the chief official, named after Babylonian deities. Then we read in verse 8, very significant, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. So Daniel takes a stand. Knowing the Mosaic law against Gentile prepared food, and for other reasons perhaps, he felt convicted and picked his battle. Verse 9 we read, at the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So he had nothing but veggies and water for 10 days, the Daniel diet. And then we look at verse 18. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar, the king. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah as they entered the king's service. All right, so now we're going to cover chapter 2. That was chapter 1. 2 stories are going on in the verses we're going to read. We got Daniel's story, the themes maybe being about faith, power of prayer, being used by God, all of those matters. And then there's a sub-story of God working on a pagan ruler. So let's talk about Nebuchadnezzar, the pagan ruler, for a minute. He found himself ruler of the first world empire. So Egypt was a great place, a great empire in itself, but was self-contained. A big influence on the world around it, but never ruled the world around it. Well protected if you stayed in Egypt, the desert and the Nile area. But when venturing out, the Egyptians didn't have the success of Babylonia. Babylonia was truly a world empire. They grew from tribes, the Babylonians, they took over the Assyrian Empire, then the Syrian Empire, then overcame the Egyptians, and in effect, discounting the powerless Greeks at the time, the then known world was ruled over by one man, and that man was Nebuchadnezzar. So this was likely a heavy situation on Nebuchadnezzar's mind, and it was during this time that God spoke to him. We're about to read of an event that happened in 604 BC, remember. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. So the king has an unusual recurring dream he believes is significant. God let Nebuchadnezzar know he had something to say, but that's as far as the king can get in his darkness. Verse 2, so the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. So he calls on all of his wise men. And what happens in verse 4? Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it. So this is one of the jobs of the soothsayers or the diviners. This is what they do. I'll spare you the gory details of ways to foretell the future with an animal's liver or things like that. But they are considered the most elite group of wise men. And they say, give us the dream. We'll do some magic and we'll give you an interpretation. But the king replied to the astrologers, this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me. So the king remembers the dream, calls in his wise men, and the king wants both the interpretation, which is typical, and the dream itself. So wise men are not surprised at his wanting an interpretation, but getting the dream, using magic for the dream, the king won't give it. Why no dream telling this time? Because that's the way he normally would do it, is tell the dream and then they would interpret it. Maybe it's a big test to see how much they're yes men or how badly they're yes men. Maybe he's lost confidence in their ability. Maybe he's tired of the superstition. You'll notice the king offers rewards or punishment depending on the outcome. And as you can see, that is quite an extreme punishment, don't you think? I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. Well, what do they do? Once more they replied, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will interpret it. Then the king answered, I am certain that you are trying to gain time, because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there is just one penalty for you. You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then, tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me. So they try, the wise men try to get the dream out of him, but the king is unbending. And he even, it looks like to me, accuses them of being fakes. So now the wise men speak a little bit of truth here in verse 10. The astrologers answered the king, there is not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or astrologer, also called Chaldeans. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men. So it's true the king is asking for something too difficult. It's impossible for any human. When the wise men say no one can reveal it to the king except the gods, they pave the way for Daniel to enter the picture, as we'll soon see. And how does the king respond to this? This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. So the king has blown his top, so much so that he wants to kill his wise men. And unfortunately, that includes Daniel and his 3 friends. Now, you might be asking, where was Daniel and his buddies during this? I'm coming up with 2 explanations. One explanation is that Daniel and his 3 friends were still in training. They weren't full-fledged wise men of the court yet. So they wouldn't have been at that initial time with the king. But because they were still considered wise men, they were included with the order to kill all the wise men. And perhaps a second explanation is that for Daniel and his friends, to avoid contact with the pagan leaders or with their magic, he and his buddies didn't come at the king's summons. So whatever the practical reason, it was part of God's plan. Daniel and the 3 are to be put to death. Not looking good. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, remember him, he was already dealt with Daniel about the food. So when the commander of the king's guard had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, and we're going to find out in a couple of verses, it was probably a bring them all in and execute them together kind of execution being carried out. So Daniel spoke to him with wisdom, to the guard. Wisdom and tact. Other translations, discretion and discernment. There's that wisdom in dealing with others we saw in the last chapter. So he asked the king's officers, why did the king issue such a harsh decree? Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went in to the king and asked or requested for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Notice he didn't ask for the dream like the other wise men. Now this was a bold move on Daniel's part, especially given the fact that the king had already accused the other wise men of stalling for time. Maybe it caught the king off guard, or Daniel was evidently held in high esteem by the king. Even getting an audience with him under the circumstances shows it. Apparently Daniel's reputation and boldness and credibility paid off. He gets some time. As we see in verse 17, if you want to read, Daniel runs off by himself in verse 17, hides in a corner, and begins sweating bullets. And then in verse 18, he began shouting to all who could hear, God of my fathers, why did you get me into this mess? No, he didn't. That's not what is in verse 17 and 18. Let's look at what 17 and 18 has to say. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So what's he do? He doesn't run off, hide in a corner. He prays. He urges his friends to pray. He asks God for mercy. This might be the first recorded small group, and this might be the first prayer chain. But that is what Daniel did. He prays. And then during the night, in verse 19, during the night the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. So back in verse 19, did you catch that? Daniel got a vision. The mystery was revealed. And what did Daniel then do? He praised God. That was a lot of praise there, Daniel, to God. He goes into prayer mode. Pretty potent prayer expressing God's wisdom and power. So Daniel has received a revelation from God. And what happens next? Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, Do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dream for him. Arioch took Daniel to the king, Arioch, to the king at once and said, I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dreams mean. The king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? Daniel replied, a real truth here. No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he is asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you lay on your bed are these. As you were lying there, O king, your mind turned to things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than other living men, but so that you, O king, may know the interpretation, and that you may understand what went through your mind. So amazing how God, in his infinite wisdom, had events occur as they did. If Daniel had been at that initial meeting of the wise men, the king would not have given him time. If God gave him the dream and the interpretation right there, if he was there with them, he would have vindicated the wise men, and it wouldn't have been a separate event from Daniel and his God giving the information. So from this story in Daniel's life, we have a great model of dealing with needs. Admittedly, Daniel's need was pretty serious. His life was in serious jeopardy. Our needs for things may not be as dramatic, but they're real needs still. It would be to our benefit to have attitudes similar to Daniel. And I've listed some of them that come up. Let's see, we have faith, trust, calmness, confidence, recognizing our own inabilities, and expectation, and asking for mercy. Now, for Daniel's need and for needs that we come across, once the need has been met, it's time to give God praise and thanksgiving, just as Daniel did. Time to give God the credit. Time to give God the glory. A couple more things I think this story brings out. God's work is best seen in impossible predicaments. God's work is best seen in impossible predicaments. And then troubles can help us realize our need to trust in Him. Things that come our way, things where we need help, they can help us to realize our need to trust in God. We can also benefit from prayer requests and group prayer, as we saw here with Daniel and his friends. And lastly, when God works, there's only room for praise, not pride. That's where I'd like to leave it. Next week, we'll look at the king's dream. We'll look at what transpires there. In the meantime, you all take care, be safe, and may the Lord be with you.